might not eat peas, but at least acting like peas. All I'm gonna say is.
So we did move that over to the middle of the 13th, but they're gonna keep all the these are some of the ones.
Look, I've got the three of you. I need one second. The guy who invented the wheel was Wayne Powell. He came to our hearing that we did during the summer on the Griffin. He wrote the original cemetery act. That way you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But she's great. Julie's doing a great job. Oh, she's great.
April 1.
Yeah, Wayne Powell.
Larry said, he was, I'm not sure what he's up to now.
I'll talk to him.
Yeah, that may handle the election stuff. County's happy? Well, they got everything they want. There's some that are not. So now it's
Not the dream.
we're all in
All right, welcome everybody. I believe we are at 3:30, and I know that the Secretary of State has provided some time in his schedule special, so we want to make sure we are understand the valuable time that he's given us. Representative Williams, would you open us in a quick word of prayer, please, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's bow our heads. Dear God, thank you for another day. Thank you for the courage to face another day. Please grant us the courage, the wisdom, the moderation that we need. Bless our men and women in harm's way, in uniforms, and our peace officers as they try to keep calm in this world today. Please bless our elected officials and give them the strength, the courage, the knowledge to carry forward and to help this great state of Georgia. Bless us all. Amen.
Fellow members, I want to appreciate your attendance today. Thank you for being here. We're going to listen to the substitute, and I'm going to go down front and present House Bill 757, mention any changes that was already voted out of this committee to rules. With that, I'm going to suspend and turn the chairmanship over to our trusty vice chair, Mr. Todd Jones. Sorry.
No, you go right ahead.
I'm gonna ask Secretary Raffensperger and Mr. Ryan Germany to join me down front as well. Here, why don't you sit next to?
Chairman Blackman, my understanding is you're going to go through the changes to the substitute to House Bill 757.
I am going to mention the substantive changes, and then I think Secretary Raffensperger and Mr. Germany may speak to some of the legalities of the bill in its entirety, and we'll take questions and then
Okay, thank you.
Mr.
Chairman. Yeah, Chairman Blackman, if you can just say the LC number before you start, and then let's get going. Thank you.
You got it. This is House Bill 757. It's a committee substitute, LC 289626S. And I think, as mentioned before, this addresses a registration component during certain runoffs. It clears up and kind of addresses that regarding some legal matters that and cleans up the code. I know that the Secretary's office could speak a little bit more to that. It also, as historically given the Secretary of State's office the ability to set qualifying, this actually puts it into code. And then Section 6, which we're dealing with a special primary in a special election. Given certain circumstances, we did add a portion to that would say if there is only one person that qualifies on both sides, that there is no need to hold that primary. And then additionally in Section 7, we have added the State House and Senate races would be captured to hold a special primary in addition to a special election should that be needed. And I move on to Section 8, and it has an effective date for Section 7 and 6 of January the 1st of 2020. 2021. And again, these are some suggestions and requests from fellow House members that we are trying to incorporate and include, so as to improve what the bill does, and also as it relates to the primary process and the trust in that primary process, and expand it in a proper and way for Georgians. With that, I'm going to, Ryan, I believe, turn it over to you guys and let you all kind of maybe discuss some of the legalities.
You want to speak here?
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to provide a little more background on some of the parts of this bill that have already been presented to this committee. Section 1 codifies existing practice of the Secretary of State's office setting a qualifying period for special elections. That's been in place for a long time, and some questions were raised about it earlier this year, late last year. And so this just codifies existing practice for that. Section 2, 3, and 4 deal with the issue of, and 5, deal with the issue of we have a special, for a general primary runoff. So for the runoffs that are going to occur in July of this year. Then, sorry, I'm Ryan Germany. I'm General Counsel, Secretary of State's Office. Sorry. So for the primary runoffs, there was a court case a few years ago that found that for federal primary runoffs, we have to have a voter registration deadline of 30 days before that runoff. Georgia law has previously said that you have to be eligible to vote in the primary to vote in the primary runoff. So that court decision changed it for federal primary runoffs. It did not change it for state primary runoffs. So right now we're in the position of having an election on the same day. The federal and state primary runoffs are on the same day, and with different voter registration deadlines. And that's not really an ideal situation from an election administration standpoint. So what this bill does is for that election on the same day, this year I think it's July 21st, then it matches up the voter registration deadlines for those elections. We think that'll be helpful as we move into this election year.
And Mr. Germany, can you refer to the specific line?
It's basically 96, 97, and 98. And then the following sections are basically cleanup, kind of code cleanup related to that change.
Thank you. Mr. Germany, do you have any further remarks?
No, I'm happy to take any questions.
Before we take questions from you, Mr. Germany, Secretary Raffensperger, do you have any comments?
Well, that was the first change, I guess you'd say. Then there's the next section, if you want to talk about that. Do you want us to deal with all of them and then take questions for all of them, or do you want to break it up into two?
I would like to do all the comments first, and then we'll come back and do questions.
Okay. Ryan, if you want to explain.
Sure. So section 6 that Chairman Blackman spoke to deals with having special primaries, basically in the limited sense when you could kind of fit it into the normal election process. And there's some limiting factors there that say they're required when it is a special election for a partisan office. The partisan office is filled on a temporary basis by appointment, which limits it in Georgia to basically U.S. Senate, constitutional officers, and district attorneys. And the special election can be conducted in conjunction with the November general election. And then the vacancy occurs prior to the qualifying period. So this section basically says if there's time to conduct the special election, in the normal election process, then you go ahead and do that. So I think that's fine. Section 7 is a little bit more problematic. That's the one that deals with, I should say complicated, is the one that deals with the special primaries for General Assembly. And just one thing I think for you guys to keep in mind, or a few things, this would result in more elections for counties to run. And that's a pretty big thing, given when we have an election, it's not just one day, it's 3 weeks of early voting for a special election, 1 week of early voting for a special election runoff, 3 weeks for voting for a special primary, 1 week for a special primary runoff, 3 weeks for a special election, and then another week for a special election runoff. So this could result in significantly more elections for counties, and I think that's something to be aware of. These elections won't be held, unlike the elections in Section 6, which would be held on days where there are already elections. You're just adding a race. That's not really a big deal from an election administration standpoint. This is adding new elections, so that is a bigger deal. And I think just thinking through it, it adds a significant amount of time from kind of qualifying to filling a seat. I think the drafters have tried to limit it to situations where the vacancy occurs after the end of the regular session, before 60 days prior to the November of that year. So they're trying to kind of set that in there, but even then, a vacancy that occurs in the fall of a year would probably not be filled until very close to the end of the session, if you go through this process. And pardon me?
Excuse me, Representative Collins?
That's correct.
Mr. Germany, does that finish your remarks regarding Section 1 through Section 8?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Secretary Raffensperger, do you have anything to add?
No, I think our lead counsel, Ryan Germany, pretty much covered it all.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We'll go ahead and we'll take questions now. Representative Oliver?
Thank you, sir, and I'll address this question to anybody you'd like to answer. What portion of the substitute have we seen before just now? I'm trying to be trying to clear up my mind as to what 757 originally was and what's new in this document.
Different from what was passed out prior.
Yes.
You would find that up under section 6, the language that discusses it should where it talks about it only should be held in the event that more than one candidate qualifies. So that portion is an addition to what section 6 is. Section 7 that in its entirety that captures state house and senate seats, and then also the effective date under section 8.
I'm confused about what actually was in the original bill, and what is a different subject matter in this bill. And that's where I'm confused, and maybe everybody else understands this but me.
From a substantive standpoint, my answer to that question would be is that we're not changing any substance regarding the whole jungle primary, other than we're capturing state races, House and Senate, and then we're also pushing the effective date forward to 2021, such that it would not impact anything until that date and beyond.
If I may follow up.
Please.
Is this your legislative package for 2020, Mr. Secretary, or is there other bills that your Secretary of State's office will be seeking?
We have another bill we'd like to do for some House Bill 316 tweaks and cleanup. This is really just relating to the primaries, and then section 6, the portions 7 and 8. Those were just added this afternoon, which the ones you were questioning.
So it's not a vehicle for other legislation that you're considering. You're going to have a separate bill for that.
That's what our intention would be.
Okay. Thank
Chairman,
you.
Representative Oliver, you good?
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Chairman Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question on line 50, and it's just for clarification, where you indicate that the candidacy would go to the office of the superintendent. Should it have the word election superintendent? And in some cases, we have a probate judge that acts in that position. Does that make a difference in it? Or is it implied?
So the superintendent in the counties that have a probate judge, the probate judge is the superintendent.
Okay, I just didn't know if you had to note that, or it's already assumed and it's indicated in their
It's-
description.
It's in the definitions in existing code.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor. Representative Gullett?
I don't have anything.
Wave? Say, let's go. Leader Trammell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start at the back and work backwards if I can. With respect to Section 8, can you illuminate why we're changing to an effective date of January 1, 2021?
Can I eliminate?
Illuminate. or can you
Illuminate,
tell
I'm
us-
sorry.
Right.
I misunderstood you. I knew you probably.
It's the West Georgia accent.
All parts of Georgia have a little bit of something accent-wise, I think. The effective date being January 1st was requested by members of our body, and I it was also challenged as part of one of the considerations, given how the current race, I guess you could say, in the Senate is playing out.
Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up with that. Well,
Please do.
I mean, if the policy is good for January 1, 2021, why isn't it good for February 17, 2020 going forward?
I think that's for every member to determine on their own. Yes, sir. You make it's a fair point.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question about a different section of the bill?
You may.
With respect to Section 1, when I look at the change on lines 39 and 40, which I understood you to say is a codification of existing practice with respect to setting these special election dates. My first question is, I just want to confirm that the Secretary of State makes the call of the election, correct? Issues the call.
The governor issues a writ.
Excuse me, Mr. Germany, could you speak into the microphone?
The governor issues a writ for a special election, and Secretary of State's office calls the election and sets a qualifying date at that time.
Okay. So as I read the election, if I might follow up, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
as I read the language, this literally says that the Secretary of State has the discretion to set the registration or set the qualifying date from the call of the election, which is at the discretion of the Secretary of State, for 2.5 days. Am I reading that right? So you can do it as quickly as the call, but no later than 60 days prior to the special election.
For a federal election, yes, sir, that's true.
And if I could ask one final question, Mr. Chairman.
One more.
Why don't we set a firm time and statute where we don't have to guess what the Secretary of State's discretion is as to when the call will be issued or when registration? Wouldn't that be more understandable and readily accessible to all Georgians to know that in the event of a vacancy, that qualifying would occur 5 days after the call of the election or 10 days? You can pick any number you want, but that would set it in stone so we wouldn't have to guess, and would also eliminate the possibility of gaming the call of the election, so you get like what I would call a quick snap in football, so that the other side doesn't know that there's a qualifying about to take place.
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say as long as I'm in a Secretary of State office, that's never happened in terms of gaming anything. But I would also add that in some instances, particularly in General Assembly races, when the election needs to be quick, then qualifying will be on the same date as the call, just from a standpoint of when the election has to be, when qualifying needs to be, when it needs to be complete. And that's what basically leads to those determinations.
Thank you. Representative Turner?
Thank you. This would, for Chairman Blackman, has ACCG seen or had opportunity to digest the language around General Assembly elections?
I think the discussion's been ongoing for some time, so I would imagine it's been contemplated at the very least.
Do you know if they've expressed support, neutrality, or opposition to what we're trying to do?
I have not heard one versus the other either way, no, sir.
Who would be picking up the cost of the extra elections for the General Assembly special elections in this bill?
Well, I think if it's deferred from, it would fall upon. Well, I may have to let the Secretary of State's office answer that. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, Representative. I'd be guessing.
Thank you. I'll come back to you in a second.
Hold on,
That cost would go to the counties running the elections.
So the counties, so that everybody could hear what you said, I'm going to repeat it. The counties would pick up the tab on paying for the special elections for the General Assembly in this case. Okay. Just if you would indulge me, Chairman Blackman, for the sake of the committee, would you timeline for us, like give us a scenario for each of these elections, both the federal and the General Assembly? Just show us, if we can imagine, how many days from the time somebody resigns or leaves office for whatever reason to the time that those offices are filled before we're able to fill those positions? Could you just give us a timeline of how it would actually work?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably defer to legal interpretation on some of that. I generally know the buffers, but I would rather get you kind of a diagram and maybe get those sheets out. But if Mr. Germany can answer the question.
For timing purposes, Mr. Germany, if you could answer that question, and then Representative Turner, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Is that okay?
That was my last question.
Okay, thank you. Pardon me, Mr. Germany.
So, to take an example, a vacancy that occurs in General Assembly after the regular session of the first year. So let's say it's April, and there'd be qualifying. You could have an election, a special election primary, as early as May, and then you would have to schedule for a special primary runoff 28 days later than that. You have to schedule for that even if you're not sure when's going to happen. And then 28 days following that, you could have a special election. And then 28 days following that, you could have a special election runoff.
Thank you, Mr. Germany. Representative Collins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is more directly to the Secretary of State. This was your piece of legislation, is that correct? This was a piece of legislation you asked for, is that correct?
The original legislation was our legislation.
And what was your intent in bringing that? What was the reasoning behind that?
To put clarity, there were some discussions. There was, I guess, common practice is that would be that the governor would make an appointment, then there would be a general, a special election primary, a jungle primary as it's been called. And so we wanted to have that clarity. Some people were saying, would that election be called in September or would it be called in March? And we wanted just to clarify that, in law, that'd be, called in March. And that's when people would qualify for any special election that would occur in 2020.
Follow up.
Please.
Do you believe those jungle elections are problematic? Do you feel that?
Well, I have said that. I was quoted as saying that out there. And that's why I also then said, this brings up a good issue. In fact, I've been in several runoffs, city council, state rep. State rep is actually a jungle primary. We had 3 Republicans, 1 Democrat, and a Libertarian. And that had several, cycles to it. Then last year, I was in some runoffs also. And so I understand the issues with that, and that's why I believe that the best process really would be is to have a commission, dig into this, because it's very complicated. You have, first of all, Senate seats, you have congressional seats, then you have your House and Senate. And then what do you do about county commissioners? Is that something that we touch or don't touch? How broad of an expanse do we want to really capture? And that's why I thought once we come out of session, we'd probably have a commission and then come back with legislation so we could do this, next year. The bill's written, has it starting for January 1st, 2021, but then it also obviously with section 6, 7, and 8, with adding the additional state reps and state senators, brings up other issues. One that was already asked was the cost for the counties.
We're good. Great. Representative Williams?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is for the Secretary of State. So my question is, looking at Section 1, it doesn't look to me like there's, once you make the call, there's anything in here that would require public notice.
So when you make a call, that's defined as publishing the notice in a paper of general circulation in the county. It's defined in existing code.
So you're saying when you make the call, that's when you announce the qualifying period?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's public record?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I thought I heard something about a situation in South Georgia this year where there was not sufficient public notice before the qualifying ended, but perhaps I'm mistaken.
The code defines how the call is noticed.
I understand.
And so someone might not feel that's sufficient, but that's the process set out in existing code.
Thank you, Representative Williams. Chairman Fleming?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the panel at the table, as I try to wrap my mind around changes that we're making to election law, I first always have to try to get what the current law is straight in my mind, then think about the goal of the change, and then try to think through what the change does. In this situation, as it relates to jungle primaries, currently we have them when we have special elections because we don't go through a normal primary process.
when you go through a normal primary process, you narrow down the election to a few people for the voters to choose from. Obviously, usually a Democratic candidate, a Republican candidate, sometimes an independent, maybe sometimes a Libertarian. When we have special elections, we don't narrow that field, and thus we call it the term jungle primary, because you can have 7 or 8 different people in there. You can have 2 or 3 Republicans, you can have 2 or 3 Democrats, you could have a Libertarian, a Constitutionalist, a Green Party person, or whatnot. So when I think about the idea of us getting rid of jungle primaries, I think about us trying to narrow that election process a little bit and make it a little bit more like what we would say a normal election is like. And that's where I want to ask a question about number 7, section 7 of the bill. Right now, section 7, if I understand it correctly, and I'm not sure that I do, but section 7 of the bill would narrow the process, so to speak, by giving us 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. But it would not narrow the process in the sense that you could have 3 Constitutionalists, 2 Green Parties, and 3 Libertarians run if they want to, because the only people that we're limiting is Republican and Democrat. Is that correct?
Certainly. That is correct, intentionally correct. But as I understand you to say that you believe that we should make this look as much like a general as possible. Is that your submission?
I began with the supposition that that was mostly the thought with getting rid of a jungle primary. It was mine. I don't intend to relay that to everybody else. It may or may not be everybody else's thought process.
Yes, sir.
So actually, section 7 of the bill, instead of making it look more like what I will call a normal election, you would still have an element of the jungle primary in there, with the exception of 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. But I could call myself a Democrat socialist and run, or I could call myself a Republican constitutionalist and run, and I would get to be on the ballot with the 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
All done with intentionality. I mean, special elections are available to us for a reason. And I hear you to say correctly is that, you feel like maybe it should look more like a general, but I think there's only so much that can be done in those instances, but certainly understand where you're coming from.
Thus potentially
Mr.
one
Chairman.
of my, thus potentially one of my questions for you, Mr. Chairman, if I may. Understanding that the unintended consequences of changes to election law can sometimes surprise us. In my 20 years, I've seen it happen, and I've heard about it happening long before I got here. Would the chairman be amenable, possibly, to including the portions of the bill that are there, with maybe the exception of 7, and maybe us in some form or fashion looking at that a little bit longer to decide how we might want to think through that whole process?
Actually, Section 7 is more of a response to general membership within, our body and within the General Assembly and with others. I would respectfully, ask that be contemplated as it moves through the process, continue to be contemplated as it moves through the process by you and others that have similar concerns, Mr. Chairman.
So you want to leave it in right now?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Fleming. Representative Shannon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A lot of the new language in the bill around the qualifying periods talk about half days, and I just wonder why you're including half days. How would you decide what is the deadline of a half day, and why not just have it as a whole day, just so it'd be less ambiguous? Pretty much every section that talks about qualifying has 2.5 the half days.
So I'll take that one. That's an existing code for special elections. The minimum is 2.5 days. And the way that we handle that generally is, for the full days, it's 9 to 5. For the half days, I believe it's 9 to 1.
Okay.
And that when we issue the call, we set out the exact times of when qualifying is.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Powell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I've sat here and I've listened to all of this, and it goes back to one thing, and that's when this bill left the subcommittee, what we were talking about was clearing up this issue of jungle primaries. Now, we've got elections going forth, but I thought I heard somebody say something about setting up a commission to do this. And I have concerns that we're not going to go ahead and do that in time for this year's series of elections. Did I hear something about a commission that was going to be looking at this?
Just like, just like we had the Safe Commission to look into the new voting machines on something that is fairly broad and complicated. When you have special elections, I thought it'd be best really to take the time and really unpack it, not just for a U.S. Senate seat, not just for a U.S. congressional seat, but also state reps, state senators, and also county commissioner. You know, how broad and what are the different ramifications? Because as we hear today from some of the questions that you've had, there will be some ramifications, and that was really what I was saying. The bill currently written would not take effect anyway until January 1st, 2021. And that's right there in subsection 8, I believe, line 268.
I understand that, but, you know, originally we were talking about trying to implement these changes this year. So are you saying that it would be in the best wisdom to put it off, let a commission to look at this, to come up with recommendations, as opposed to doing it this year?
Mr. Chairman, Secretary, Mr. Germany, do you want to make an opinion on that, or do you want to waive?
I think I'll just restate what I just said. I think that the purpose of the bill originally was to really codify what had been standard practice, and that I believe it was the understanding of just about everyone, except a few people that were writing different articles about when the election could be called for a special election in the U.S. Senate seat. And some people started saying, well, you call it in September. And the general thought was that it would be called, you know, on the March 2nd date when everyone else qualifies, and that'll be the call for the U.S. Senate seat. So the purpose, that's how the bill originally was drafted, just to codify that, what that would be. And then it went through some changes as it is perfected as it goes through the General Assembly. And so that's where we are today with some additional changes that we just happen to see today. So I say all that is I think that it's a very broad and issue that deals with several different races. It's not just a one-off for a congressional seat like the 6th District we had a few years ago, or a state Senate seat or House District seat. You know, what is something that will be workable going forward for a long period of time and give people a consistent and a workable basis for these situations that arise for special elections.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Representative Nguyen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize if you explained this already, but I just wanted to get a better sense for timeline. So the bill as it's written now goes into effect 2021, but if it were to go into effect immediately, what would the timeline look like for any special elections going on now? Specifically, just want to frame it around the Senate seat that we've been talking about. If this were to go into effect now, would that special election be rolled into the May primary?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Representative Collins.
Yeah, I got one quick question for you, Mr. Secretary. In Section 7, isn't that just reflective, the language in there, isn't it just reflective of what it is in current code for a regular election when we're talking about the process? Isn't that what's in current code right now?
I don't believe so.
That's not the current process, the way it's set up?
The current process for
having a regular election, not a special election, but the way the process works out, where we're talking about the candidates from a Democrat or Republican. Is that not what we have now?
So it's not exactly. I think it does end up with one Republican nominee and one Democrat nominee. The timing is different.
Okay.
You know, the regular process is like it is this year, where people will qualify in March, there'll be a primary in May, and that primary determines the Republican and the Democrat nominee. This will be different timing, of course, for elections. And then there's also different, a special election has different rules about ballot access for third parties and independents. So in a regular election, third parties and independents have to get a certain amount of signatures after they qualify. For a special election, they don't have to.
Okay.
The history behind that is for a while, special elections in Georgia were nonpartisan. So for instance, when Zell Miller was appointed to the U.S. Senate in 2000, and then he ran in that November, there was no partisan identification on any of the candidates. And then the General Assembly changed it to allow people to put in their partisan identification. And so that's basically where we are now. You can put your partisan identification when you run for a special election, but anybody can run. You don't.
Thank you, Mr. Germany. Representative Collins, is that enough? Okay, thank you. I believe last but not least, Representative Turner is on for an encore performance.
Just so I want to make sure I understood the timeline that you gave earlier, using April. And if I did that math, it was 4 months to fill a General Assembly seat. We had recently, tragically, a member pass away in December during the middle of a biennium. In that particular case, we'd be looking at April before we'd be able to fill a sitting member seat.
So based on the timing of when that happened, it would just fall under the regular process that happens now of a special election. And then
So it would be a jungle primary because of the nature of the time that, okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Representative Turner. Representative Oliver.
Is the intent or the effect of this particular language designed to make special elections more partisan? And secondly, to eliminate the opportunity for third-party candidates to run?
No, ma'am. I think it is essentially to apply the primary process to these special elections. And if, I understood you correctly, it would actually, I guess, within the special election environment, it would not change the ability for other parties in the way in which they can qualify, is my understanding of it legally.
How many special elections do we have on average for the State House or State Senate in the last 5 years? I'm trying to remember. It sounds like 4 or 5 a year. Do you know?
I was going to say 2 or 3 a year, but somewhere in between, kind of obviously 2 on the low end and 5 on the high end in a year.
Hypothetically, if I identified myself as an independent, as some members of our body have done, does the current law allow me to run as an independent under this version of this bill?
In a special election?
Yes.
Yes, I think now you would run as an independent in basically a jungle primary, and in this bill you would still run as an independent in the special election.
But the statute allows me to put I by my name or R or green for Green Party. Is that how it reads? I don't really
Yes,
know.
ma'am. That's how it works.
Were you asking about current law or proposed law? The current law, is that
The
proposed law is what I was
proposed law is
asking.
this. The current law is the same as the proposed law. And in other words, according to Legislative Counsel, when I asked that question, I think you brought it up before, Representative Oliver, perhaps when we discussed this, but be happy to further clarify that for you, if
I'm just trying to figure out how this impacts third parties and whether it changes the law in relation to third parties.
So this doesn't change the law for third parties for special elections. It changes the law for Republicans and Democrats in special elections.
Representative Oliver, do you have a follow-up?
No, sir. Thank
Okay, thank you. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My only question goes back to, I guess, Section 7. I know in Baldwin County, it cost about $30,000 to put on an election in that county. So, and that's what I'm concerned about. And since we've been sitting here, I've heard from some constituents in some small counties, it's hard enough for them to afford running water and doing what they're doing, but then taking on more special elections in these counties, I think we need possibly some state assistance or something. But my phone's blowing up from my county commissioners that we can't afford more elections. So I think it's something we really need to look at. We don't want to, I know some of these small rural counties are very poor, and we're putting a bind on them. But that's just my opinion, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I would just say, Section 6 does not provide for additional elections. It just provides for additional races in existing elections. Section 7, as you pointed out, would provide for additional elections.
Right.
Representative Williams, are you good? Thank you. Chairman Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple clarifications, going back to Representative Oliver. In this special election, you could end up with 1 R, 1 D, and 2 Is?
There's no limit to the number of other independent.
Okay, so
people.
any independent, so you could end up with a half a dozen independents, but 1 R and 1 D.
You could do that now.
Okay, and now you could have 2 Rs, 3 Ds, anything you wanted. That's fine. But the only ones that are limited would be the R and the Ds.
You're not limited.
Excuse me, Chairman Blackman, can you use the mic? Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, my apologies. That as many could run as they wanted to, but they would be subject to a special primary.
Okay, and another, if I could follow up.
Please.
Speaking of the cost
Isn't that right?
to county governments, and again, some smaller rural communities, particular, this is going to be a burden for them. It may affect the state. Do you have costs? Is there been a fiscal note for the state or any estimation of what it will cost a county to be able to have these extra elections, what the cost would be? I feel like the idea of when you set once the writ is given and you then set it, you can try to match it up with an upcoming election, and I'm sure that's what would be done. But in the event there isn't one close enough to do it with, the costs of it for the rural counties, and again, the state will incur some expense just because you have to calculate it and certify whatever election's done. Do we know what that cost would be?
They may know the answer to the specific cost. I guess what I would, just throw out for consideration, Madam Chair, is that when you have based on a special election, if you were to add a primary for our races, you add potentially one extra race, but only in the event that you may have alternate folks in that race, or people qualify for that race. And so you still have the race itself and the runoff in a jungle, and you would have the other 3. I'm not sure what the stats are, but I don't recall, at least in the last 3 elections, that there were any other members running other than Ds or Rs. So in those instances, you would not have any additional. You would, I guess, you would conceivably, if you just had one of each, it would be less money to that particular county potentially. I guess if you had a third party or something else, depending on where the numbers fell, I guess it could at any time run that way.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor. Seeing no more questions from the committee, Chairman Blackman, would you like to make any final comments?
No, sir, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the discussion, appreciate the input, and again, we're obviously trying to bring forth a bill that is useful and helpful on behalf of what the requests are from the Secretary of State's office and those that believe in a primary process and party process within that primary.
Thank you, Chairman Blackman. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion. Chair has a motion to pass LC 289626S and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none. All in favor of the substitute to House Bill 757, please say aye. Aye. All opposed, say no. No. We're going to have to go to hands, please. Please raise your right hand if you are in favor of substitute to HB 757. Right hand, please. Thank you. And if you could raise your left hand for no, please. Okay. Motion passes 9-6. Congratulations, Chairman Blackman. Any other business in front of the committee?
You can adjourn it.
We can adjourn it?
You can
We're
adjourn
adjourned.
it. You can adjourn it.